Welcome to the Whitmer Cast, a podcast by the John Whitmer Historical Association. We bring you essays, interviews, panel discussions, and broadcasts related to Mormon history and restoration studies. Today we have a great episode lined up. Magen Edvalson will be talking about Mormon folklore with Christine Blythe and Christopher James Blythe. If you'd like to join JWHA or visit our entire backlog of episodes in JWHA journals, go to www.jwha.info. With that out of the way, let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Whitmer cast. I'm your host for this episode, Magen Edvalson. I am a folklorist turned ethnographer working for the Community of Christ Archives. And today with me are two folklorists from BYU, Chris and Christine Blythe. Hi, Blythes.
Hey, how
Hi,
are you?
thanks for having us on. We're excited to
We're
be here.
excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you, especially with things going on your end with podcasts growing, which we'll talk about, but it's just you're all over podcasts right now. So I'm excited that you were able to come on with us today.
Well, thank
Um,
you.
so our audience is a lot of people are going to be interested in history, but today we are talking about folklore. And this was an episode I really wanted to host because I myself am a folklorist, I suppose. Not as well seasoned perhaps, but I want to hear from two people I trust with this question. Our first question is, what is folklore? And maybe there's a second part. We'll get to that. So what is folklore?
Well, folklore is kind of the everyday traditions of people. So when we think of folklore, often our mind goes directly to legend or mythology or fairy tales, but it's much more than that. It's the traditions we keep in our home. It's the way we interpret our faith if we're going to talk about religion. It's it's certainly the
It's all sorts of
stories we
things.
tell, whether that's personal narrative or whether that's legends that circulate and kind of transform. So when we talk about folklore, we're talking about those traditional things and kind of the variations that develop. And because we're talking about religion today, a term that might be familiar to more historians or religious studies scholars is lived religion. And so as folklorists, we use the term vernacular religion a lot, but our historians might understand that term lived religion, kind of the on the ground experience of religious people, that everyday sort of interpretation of religion.
Yeah. One of the essentials of folklore is that it's transmitted unofficially. It's if we were going to think about the folklore of Mormonisms, we'd think if you go to church and you're being using a manual and you're reading from a creed and you're participating in an ordinance that's supposed to be performed in a specific ritualized way, well, that's not very folklore. But if you're back home and mom and dad is explaining their theory about some sort of religious idea, that's then going to be passed to this child who passes it on to another child, and so on. That's a great example of folklore. It's the unofficial, and yeah, it's stories, it's traditions, it's objects, it's all sorts of things. But really, it's for this purpose, I mean, it's the unofficial. We look at things. We're less interested in church positions than we are by the culture of everyday people.
Yeah, and I mean I agree with those. One of the things that I learned as a student is that the definition of folklore kind of is folklore, right? Because we all have different things that we can add to it and different perspectives. And so one thing I want to add is I think of variation, and I'm fascinated by variation and how things change just ever so slightly. There's the one joke, right, where a girl sees her mother preparing a pot roast for dinner and she cuts the ends off And she says, "Why do you do that, Mom?" And she says, "I don't know. Go ask your grandmother." And so she goes to her grandmother and she says, "Why do you cut the ends off the pot roast before you stick it in the oven?" The grandmother says, "I don't know. You'll have to go ask your great grandma." So she goes to her great grandma and she says, "Great grandma, why do you cut the ends off the pot roast before you stick it in the oven?" And her great grandma says, "Well, because the oven was too small when I started making pot roast." So we carry on these traditions and we don't know why we do them, but there's a reason why they happen, right? So that's variation. So I love variation and studying why things change, or
Isn't
if we
that
can
so
nail it down.
great? So folklore, because where it's unofficial, it's spreading out, and so different people have different views. But yeah, this variation means it might change over time, but it also means, particularly if we're studying Mormonism, we find out that different families are interpreting things differently. We're so focused on studying these official churches, but there's so much variation just, in a neighborhood, in a
Mm-hmm.
and independence itself, among community of Christ members.
And the generations of a family.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think those are great things to keep in mind for a definition. I'm curious, what drew you to folklore and becoming folklorists?
Yeah. So Chris and I both met up at Utah State. That's where I received my undergraduate. It was in religious studies, and I was working under Philip Barlow. And so that's kind of where I developed my interest. Well, my interest probably started well before then, but it's where I began to develop, actually develop my interest professionally in Mormon studies at large. And I think that early on I was doing vernacular religion, I was doing folklore, but I didn't really know that's what I was doing. Right. I like most people thought of folklore as Bigfoot, right? Fairy tales. And up at Utah State, of course, they've got a wonderful program up there. I took a class, but it was on cryptids, right? So that only kind of maintained like my belief in what folklore was. When I was getting ready to go to graduate school and I was looking at programs, I was looking at religious studies programs, history programs, and Chris said, you should look at a folklore program. I said, well, I don't know if I really understand what folklore is. So we flew out to American Folklore Society and a conference that they were hosting. And I spent the afternoon there, and I just knew instantly these were my people. I immediately identified with what they were doing. It was how I was interested in studying religion. That's from the ground up, right? The people's experience rather than official experience. And that's really how I came to folklore. So that was my baptism, was attending an American Folklore Society and realizing this is already what I'm doing. This is what I love. So
yeah, I have always been interested. I'm my family a few generations back is Community of Christ, and then they became Episcopalian one generation before me, and then I was born, and then I discovered the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? When I was 14. And from the time I was probably about 16, I discovered, Signature Books came out with this great CD-ROM that was called New Mormon Studies CD-ROM, I think. And it's just packed full of odd stuff. Wonderful, official books from Signature and stuff, but sort of research files and a complete run of Sunstone and dialogue. And I just fell in love with scholarship there. And I always have had an interest in things that other people think are weird. I really like that.
I think we share that interest. Yeah.
Right. And so as I've been writing papers and things, people would constantly say to me, Chris, I think you really study the weird. And then they would later on say, hey, do you know this book? And eventually people were starting to point me to folklorists. And it was David Hufford, who wrote about sleep paralysis, or, religious studies sort of influenced folklore, anthropology influenced lived religion guys like Robert Orsi, who really changed everything for me. But then I discovered that folklorists do one thing that a lot of lived religion scholars don't do, which I love, which is they want to bring the voices of people out. And so there's often these big block quotes, and historians hate this. And religion studies scholars don't usually have a lot of these big block quotes, but I love it. I love the idea of people trying to bring out the voice of someone whose voice, we're all fragile. We're all going to die in 80 years. And so these voices go away, and a folklorist actually preserves them. And for me, when I realized that, I was like, wow, I was a anthropology undergrad. I'd been introduced to folklore. And I thought it was really awesome, but I didn't think it was really possible to pursue that route. I thought religion was more my thing. And so I was headed that way. And gradually, I realized that a lot of the stuff I was doing, it was just kind of just a different turn of the way of looking at the same material.
And so we've kind of just fallen, I suppose, into folklore. So I ended up getting a master's degree up at Memorial University. We lived a year in Newfoundland in Canada, and that was a wonderful experience. And I worked as a folklore archivist at BYU for about 4 years, and Chris only 3 years ago took this position at Brigham Young University as English faculty teaching folklore. So it's been an interesting.
Probably up to 2018, most people would have called me a historian, and they just say I'm a historian of odd things, right? And then a folklorist grabbed me and said, "Hey, you're a folklorist. You need to apply to this job." And so I did. And now I don't think anyone doubts I'm a folklorist.
Yeah.
There might be some jerk out there that says I'm not a folklorist, but I don't think so.
And we should be clear, we like the history too. So
we are. We're at that cross section, right? So some folklorists do wonder how we can do so much folklore in the 19th century, but I mean, we love it.
I definitely relate to that a lot. I mean, when I did my undergraduate work was in theater, and I was really interested in ritual performance.
Yeah.
And very interested in analyzing temple rituals and how that all works. And so I figured, okay, I'll go back to the roots of temples in general and study ancient history and classics. And then when I applied for master's programs, I found this folklore thing, and I did some digging, and I was like, actually, this sounds right. Like, this sounds like it makes more sense for me, because even my interest in Mormon studies probably started when I was a kid. As soon as I knew how to read, I was reading everything I could about religion and Bigfoot. So if that doesn't tell you something,
we're on the same page, my friend.
Sounds like we had the same upbringing.
So we are the odd crew. I like to say that we're kind of the dumpster divers of the humanities. We just find all of the things that nobody wants to touch because it doesn't quite fit. There's no dates, there's no, evidence, there's no artifacts, or it's not literature, and we just take that and we'll say, well, we'll study it. We'll take care of it.
Love that. Yeah.
This is and your route is actually one that lots of people do. At BYU, there's 3 folklorists who are, full-time faculty. It's me, Jill Rudy, who does fairy tales, and then Eric Eliason, who's done Jay Golden Kimball and some things, but he actually got into the field through like what you did. He was getting through theory. He was studying
was he American Studies as well?
I think his program was American Civilization, but he was into Goffman, right? This performance studies. And then he learned about folklore and thought, whoa, let me take this Goffman stuff, this theater ideas, and move right into folklore. So
yeah,
you're in good company. That's cool.
Yeah, I have one of his books. Well, maybe I'll meet him one day.
Yeah, but come to BYU, I'll introduce you.
So we're talking about folklore, and we've talked about the definition of folklore, and maybe our audience listeners are already thinking of the different folklore that they can think of, at least in Mormon culture. But what examples of Mormon folklore can you think of? I mean, maybe name a couple, not all of them.
Sure.
Well, that's where I'd say, listen to our podcast, right?
Right. Well, absolutely.
But
Seerstones.
but I think our mind goes immediately to. So when I entered graduate school, I had all sorts of Latter-day Saints coming up to me and saying, I gotta tell you this 3 Nephite story. It was like where their mind immediately went. They couldn't think of any other example. It was always 3 Nephites. So I think that's the most obvious example that I can think of. But there's so many.
Yeah, the ones people generally think of, people are
Cain.
always wanting to talk about Cain and Bigfoot.
Cain and Bigfoot.
They want to talk. So these are legends, right? Contemporary legends. They like talking about the story of the Blanding, Utah farmer who goes out and uncovers the bones of a young Nephite girl who's resurrected in front of him.
Yeah.
But ultimately, folklore is really broad. So if you are studying if you were studying the first vision and you were just sticking to like the official writings of the first vision, well, then you're not studying folklore. But if you're going back and seeing how this idea of a vision is spreading around the early community, and you're looking at different accounts and different references and how people are talking about it, that's folklore. I mean, the first vision could absolutely be a folklore story. And lots of things in that regard. But I imagine, I bet you in Community of Christ, there's stories that involve like reunion camps, right? I would imagine these circles of believers and, remember this that happened 20 years ago, or remember this thing that we do every year,
right?
Are great examples of folklore. And I know, if we walked in and saw Rachel in the archives and we asked her stories that she's heard about different individuals, or she'd bring out strings, string scepter and things. I mean, all of those things are folklore attached to it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think of I think of reunion automatically, I think. And one thing I had it suggested to me once to collect 3 Nephite stories from Community of Christ members and to compare them to LDS stories. And I don't know that anybody's quite done that. So maybe it's an idea out there for somebody, because I don't know that I will be the one to do it. But and there aren't a lot of people left who remember those stories, because those stories aren't really told as often in Community of Christ, from what I know. But gosh, there are reunion traditions, and there's spec, like, I mean, I know LDS members have EFY, right?
Girls camp is like the
Girls
best
camp.
example, the songs they sing. Yeah.
Trek. Oh my
Trek.
goodness, Trek is huge, right? And it's those things that you do constant or every year, annually. I think I did road shows where we'd put together sketches with all the kids and go around and perform them at different places. They do something like that up here in Oregon where I live, in the mission center. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's Caravan. And they just put on a performance for different congregations and travel around the mission center, which is big. It's Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. So yeah, there are all kinds of traditions that we do.
So my great grandmother's sister, so my great great aunt, is Pearl Wilcox, who was a Community of Christ historian. And so I've inherited lots of things from her. In the background here, you can probably see a picture of her.
No, you
can you see? You can kind of see it right there. It's the glimmer in the bookshelf. The only thing in there is a picture of hers when she's like 45. But I'm a huge Pearl Wilcox fan. I've inherited lots of her papers and things. And some of them are writings of stories she's heard. And other grandparents and stuff also from the RLDS tradition. And some of them are 3 Nephite stories. Like, I went to meeting and this is what they talked about. And so sometimes folklore is recorded in these papers that are then passed down to descendants, right? So I really love your 3 Nephi idea, and the comparison between the two.
Martyrdom Canes is another one that just popped in my mind, that both
that both our
Traditions would
traditions
be
share.
really, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's awesome.
I wonder if there are RLDS or Community of Christ missionary stories. I mean, the missionaries are different in Community of Christ, right? We call them appointees, and it's a very different structure. But I think about Mormon missionary stories and how you hear about apostate missionaries who do have all these secret combinations, or just things that, or I heard once of a mission president who, it was the mission president before my mission president, who dusted his feet off to so and so, and so we don't go to that person's church or whatever. Mission folklore is one that I think of. Probably next to Three Nephites.
This is
Right.
probably, yeah, I'm obsessed with missionary folklore of every type. I'm Bert Wilson, William A. Wilson, who is we sometimes refer to him as the father of Mormon folklore. I've inherited 17 volumes of missionary folklore that he collected as an English professor at Brigham Young University, and I just cannot get enough of it. So yeah, missionary folklore is fantastic. You have everything from demonic possession to songs that missionaries sing to initiation practices, right? You're a young missionary, you're a greenie. What are the pranks that missionaries, senior companions play on you? I mean, there's just so much there. It's really rich in folklore.
One of the things that our tradition has that's so interesting is that people have folklore about each other, right?
Yes.
So our LDS members certainly have folklore of encountering Brigham Young or encountering polygamy or thoughts about the temple, I mean, all of those, just like LDS members wondering whether the Kirtland Temple is going to be sold to them, these sorts of folkloric ideas that relate to the interaction between the two people are really interesting.
Yes.
And that's where we can definitely find some great stories. If I was in Independence collecting folklore, I would probably ask people about the 1980s, like, these major moments of tension, and say, what was the reaction to, what is it, Section 156, right? This idea, people are reacting, so they're going to have stories, right? What happened to your local congregation when a non-Smith was appointed to the presidency,
or women's ordination, passing sacrament for the first time. You have an entire generation of women who are ordained. What was that like? What are the stories that they tell? And they pass on to the next generation. And yeah, there's so much work that could be done.
And so fortunately, we have the related field of oral history, right?
Yeah.
Of people collecting, just sort of life stories and things. But folklore is great because you don't just try to find the truth. You get the stories of what people are saying and what that means. So I love it. Yeah. We've answered this question probably too long. Sorry, Megan, but it's a really cool thing. Yeah.
I feel like we're just all sort of geeking out on something that, I mean, clearly we're obsessed with because we got degrees and we paid a lot of money to study this stuff.
Right.
But yeah, I agree. There's a lot there. There's a lot that still hasn't been opened, right? We still have yet to unlock a lot. I mean, especially with the digital age and digital folklore existing and changing and creating variations so rapidly, it's really hard to keep pace with it. But it's Mormon folklore is right there in the digital sphere, and it's growing, and it's something that it's a lot. I feel overwhelmed sometimes, and other times I just get really excited, like, oh, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna do this thing. So I'm gonna collect these, and yeah, it's a worthy process. It's exciting.
You know what I just realized? Sometimes historians are so nervous about someone writing about the same topic as them. One of the great things about folklore is it's limitless.
That's right.
Right? We can constantly turn up new material. If you're willing to go out and collect, get your hands dirty, then there's always something you can build
a new
on
variation. There's absolutely. That's right.
And there's not enough folklorists to really chronicle everything, right? Because it grows. It's a weed. It's if humanities is a garden, history is a very well kept bush, I'd like to say, or
Mhm.
shrub, and folklore is just the weeds around it. And
Good.
you can go in and clear them out, but they always pop up, and so eventually it's like maybe we should just stop and think about, you know, what value do we have having these weeds here? Maybe we need to let them grow. I don't know. Personally, I you should see my garden. It's very full of weeds. Very much.
I like that. And you're right. The digital folklore is so important. And so we talk about things being word of mouth or passing in a family, but there this informal sphere of Reddit and Twitter and Facebook. I mean, you probably see my Facebook page. Like I'm constantly asking people, give me some more stories. But even in those unofficial material, yesterday I went on Twitter and just typed in Mission Training Center cat, and there's all sorts of people on Reddit and Twitter who've been writing about this thing.
Yeah,
All
I just saw that.
wonderful.
Yeah, and we have historians that are looking at kind of like these profound shifts in time, whereas folklorists are really looking at these snapshots, right? These minute turns in culture. It's so
Absolutely.
fascinating.
But it gets us to a domestic sphere that sometimes historians, well, some of our best historians don't forget that sphere,
Right,
but we're prone to forget it, right?
right,
So
right. Now, Christine, you touched on a name I want to come back to, Bert Wilson. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of Mormon folklorists and how have Mormon folklorists had an impact on the realm of Mormon studies?
Yeah, why don't you talk about Austin Alta 5?
yeah,
And
yeah, I can do that.
yeah,
Sure.
and I'll talk about Bert a little bit.
So, there's all of this. I mean, if I was going to think about the history of Mormon folklorists themselves, like collecting ideas, there's a lot of informal folklorists across time, right? That
Sure.
pull things together. I think Women of Mormondom, here's a guy who goes out and collects different women's voices and asks about events. And um, it's not really a systematic history. There's a touch of folklore in that.
Oh, there's definitely folklore
Yeah.
in that. We have women kind of doing this vernacular theology sort of stuff. Like, what do I think about Heavenly
Mhm.
Mother? What do I think about
We're
women's
not
roles?
asking Brigham Young or
Brigham
the
Young,
apostles.
right? And so we're
Mhm.
getting a really like on the ground sort of, I'm figuring this out,
Yeah.
as I'm saying it or as I'm living it.
I think somebody like Gunnison or Benjamin E. Ferris, who wrote these, the Mormons in the 1850s, these guys who worked for the government living in Utah Territory. And then they wrote these sort of ethnographies that are really just a collection of rumors. And they are wonderful. I mean, these guys don't know they're folklorists, but they're folklorists. Even if it's just their love of gossip, it's got a folklore component to it. But when we think about academic folklorists, we often start with Austin and Alta Fife, and they're Jack Mormons, as they call themselves, who wrote a great book, Saints of Sage and Saddle, which collects, it's not modern folklore, so they don't cite their sources or things like that, but they collect all of these stories that people should know about Latter-day Saints, and they're about seagulls and all 3D fights, 1,000 other things. And as time passed, as folklore became a real discipline during also Altus Fife's life, 1940s, 1950s, we start getting some programs, and then people become interested in Latter-day Saints. I mean, Latter-day Saint culture in the West is a place where you have a cultural zone that was allowed to be isolated for a time. And so a really unique culture emerged. And so folklorists, of course, are interested in that, but they're also interested in these stories related, So we have lots of studies on those basic ones, seagulls and three Nephites. Already, Richard Dorson is a scholar at Indiana University, and he discovers the three Nephites and starts writing on. We call him the father of American folklore. And he starts working on that, which will lead to his student, Bert Wilson.
Right. And through Bert Wilson, we kind of have the development of folklore archives, at least in the state of Utah, which allows us to preserve, right, all of this wonderful folklore that's floating around, as early as the 70s, late 60s, 80s, into present day. And so we have these two wonderful archives at Utah State University, at Brigham Young University, that's just chock full of narratives, folklore that students have collected. And Bert Wilson just does a wonderful job. I've never met him, but I've spent a lot of time with his family and with his writings, and of course with the collections that he developed. And he just had a real gift for storytelling. And he did that he made his work really accessible, I think. And he did a great service, I think, in terms of getting Mormon folklore out there, working with historians, really kind of doing interdisciplinary work that allowed folklore to have some real strength, I think, in the humanities for quite a few years. And so, and now we have other young folklorists. If you attend American Folklore Society, which I mentioned earlier, which is kind of like the folklore, conference that everyone gathers to annually, there's this wonderful little group and growing group of students who are, specifically do Mormon folklore. So we see the tradition continuing and growing, and then leaving the state of Utah and going to other programs. So
right.
Yeah.
We have people like Tom Mold, who I think is probably
is not LDS or Mormon.
Here's a Catholic guy
who
has great interest in the Choctaw and has done amazing work with Choctaw mythology and Choctaw tales in the 2 books he wrote. He's working on another one, who also got interested in Latter-day Saints and did ethnography interviews. And I think it's the best Latter-day Saint folklore book we have, called Still the Small Voice.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
That's powerful. So we always want to plug for Tom. He's a fantastic human being, but just an even better folklorist. And this book really gets at Mormon culture.
But I really like what you said about Bert Wilson. I mean, he's a guy who left Utah. He thought he was going to study Scandinavian legend. He served his mission in Finland, right?
He did.
And he was going to study something called the Kalevala. It's sort of an epic of the Finnish people. And when he got there, he's working with Richard Dorson, and Dorson says, "You're Mormon. We need somebody to work on Mormon folklore." And Bert had written a piece on the three Nephites that rejected what Richard Dorson had just written about in his book. Dorson had said people had stopped telling three Nephites stories as they've modernized, and that these stories are really confined to Utah anyways. And here's Bert Wilson, who's gone to his local ward in Indiana and collected 17 new stories. And so he tossed that idea. And that really made him realize, I want to study my own people. When I told the story of how I got interested in folklore, but the truth is, when I showed up for I went on a mission after I got my bachelor's at Texas A&M, and I went on a mission. I worked at a bookstore for a year, and then I learned that they were starting a Mormon studies program at Utah State. And so I said, I got to go there. And so I got there one semester before Philip Barlow started teaching classes. And during that semester, I took classes on Buddhism and things. But there was one lecture that year, was the Arrington lecture that was at the Tabernacle. And the guy speaking was Bert Wilson. And I just remember being so blown away by this guy. And his point was that Mormon studies programs shouldn't forget folklore. Like, this is a key lens. And I really bought into it. This guy was like a missionary for folklore, right? Unfortunately, he wasn't a prolific writer. We just have one book where all of his materials compiled, all these articles are compiled together. It's one, it's called Mirror of the Human Experience. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The marrow of the human.
I think it's
marrow. Yeah, I think
it's human marrow's in there.
Yeah.
But really, really cool. So in folklore, remember, this is a smaller group of individuals. Mormon studies or Mormon topics are taken really seriously. Like, people come to the sessions. It's treated just like other, small cultures that people might be interested in, but has a real it attracts interesting audience, including Mormons and non-Mormons and so on. So
I remember my first day in my folklore theory class at Utah State. Lisa Gabbert was teaching, and she asked us what all of our religious backgrounds were, because she said that she notices that most people, or at least, I mean, and granted this was Utah, but most of the students that she meets are um, very religious, or at least they've come from very religious backgrounds. They're Mormon, they're Catholic, or they're Jewish. And she said that
yeah.
there's something about living in a culture like any of those. I mean, those are very diverse religious experiences, right? But there's something about growing up in a culture like that that just prepares people to be interested in these sorts of things. And so I thought that was interesting because all of us basically fell into one of those three camps. And I
Yeah.
think she herself grew up Catholic.
Mhm.
Um, but uh yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I mean, I agree that folklore's everywhere. I just read Marianne Meets the Mormons, which is about French perceptions of Mormons and using those perceptions in the
Yes.
19th century. And reading that, I was like, this is a folklore book. This is all folklore.
Mhm.
Um, and so you never know, as a historian or a French studies expert or whatever, you never know when you're actually doing folklore. But there are people who are dedicated to it, and I think it's great that we do have more. I've run into more people who are interested in Mormon folklore, and it's it's exciting. I'm excited as a young scholar to be interested in this. And
That's awesome.
And I don't think I ever meet a historian who isn't interested in having a conversation about Mormon folklore. As the second I say what I do or what my field is, it just opens the door for hours of conversation. But it would be wonderful to see a lot of more young academics kind of developing an interest in doing it,
Yeah.
academically. We're all interested in folklore, but there's
I
so
think,
much to learn.
yeah, yeah, I think that leads really well into another question I have, which is about the future of folklore studies in the Mormon studies sphere. What potential do you see, and how do you see that benefiting historians, Mormon psychologists, other disciplines that are interested in Mormon identity?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll let Chris answer the question about the future of the field as he's a professor of folklore right now, and that directly impacts him and his students. It's something I think about a lot. But in terms of what folklore offers to the historian, or why we should take seriously folklore as an academic, a thing, um, you know, we think about folklore and we think about contemporary stuff, contemporary legends, contemporary traditions, but none of these things were created in a vacuum, right? So, the stories we tell today, are 20th century history. They are 19th century history. There are different variations, there are new interpretations, but we are linked, to our forefathers and our foremothers. The demonic possession stories that I think are so fun that are in missionary lore links us right back to the 19th century and the first missionaries that go out to England. And the women and men, historians trying to understand Heavenly Mother theology and how that's developing on the ground now. And of course we turn our heads directly back to the 19th century, the past, and how early women interpreted it. And so when we talk about folklore, especially in the Mormon tradition, I mean, we are arm linked with the past, right? And so there's so much to learn in terms of how these different ideas and traditions and cultural conceptions like developed, from the 19th century forward. I had more of a thought there, and I'm kind of
I really
rambling,
like
but
that.
but I think there's something for us to think about there, that we're not just talking about a legend that's circulating today, this year, but how it really connects to the roots of our traditions.
You know, the thing that I think as a historian, I'm benefited by folklore, and as a folklorist, I'm benefited by history. But I think historians have traditionally wanted to figure out real truth. You know, we're positivists. We think there's a real truth to be able to grasp that you can somehow figure out. And so we debunk. It's like one of the basic methodologies, particularly in Mormon history. There's a lot of debunking. You know, somebody says the signers of the Declaration showed up in the St. George Temple, and the question people have is, did it really happen? Well, that's a question for like believers, right? That's not what I'm going to answer when I'm writing to the academy. I'm interested in why that story is told. You know, what are the variants of the story? And so what I hope folklore does, and I should say, I love the combination of folklore and history that we get in Mormon studies. So between pulpit and pew, you know that book?
Yeah.
It's a great,
Yeah.
I love it, right? There, so the topics are there. People are thinking about that merger, but the one thing that you see in most of those essays is that question of sort of, I mean, a methodology of debunking and a question of like absolute truth. That I think we'd be best served putting aside and thinking about the cultural questions of people. What can I learn about people with the stories they tell? Why would this story be important to them?
And I was just, the historians of tomorrow will be really grateful for the folklorists of today, because folklorists are dedicated to preservation, right? Recording stories. And so the historians of tomorrow, decade from now, 100 years from now, are going to be really grateful for the work that the folklorists have done in capturing these small cultural snapshots across time, these stories.
It's such a broad question, but when we think about it, there's so many intersections. Based on your question, I think you probably share my interest in like Mormon studies being really interdisciplinary, right? That's what I really hope to see. And so I think of folklore as a unique space that emphasizes variation. Of you mentioned, it emphasizes the regular person, regardless of their status in society. And regardless of what other people think about them, it's open. It's just so open. We're looking for these forgotten voices, and that's something everybody wants, but maybe a folklorist has figured out just a little bit how to get there, mainly because we learn how to interview, right? We learn how to take that bit from anthropology, ethnography, and get out there. And so I like what, as a folklorist, what you've done, which is you've gotten into oral history, right? Preserving voices. And so I think those are ways that we're going to unite with our people, different fields here. The question about how folklorists can benefit psychology, I love it. Psychological, I'm not, a sort of Freudian psychology has already kind of a folklore bent to it. Where we're going to ask people questions and then try to interpret those, even though that's not what I'm into. But someone who looks at story and wants to get to human experience.
Right, who values every voice.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
The psychologist can really be part of that conversation. So yeah, this conversation makes me want to convince John Whitmer to do a special issue on folklore.
I agree. I agree, because I was thinking about how ever since 2012, especially with Mitt Romney, and I mean, granted, there have been presidential candidates before who've come out of, who've come out of the LDS tradition, but you have this Mormon moment, right, which hasn't really died down necessarily, because there are things that come up in the news all the time, and you also have a lot of documentaries happening. You've got TV shows like what's the Sister Wives, right, on TLC, with polygamy, and All of these different groups within the Mormon sphere are having a spotlight on them.
Yeah.
But folklore is what unites us. And I think about how I grew up LDS
Mhm.
in the Utah church, and I went served a mission and went to the temple, and then I moved to Community of Christ. And so bridging those two worlds, I'm very interested in how they talk about each other, but I'm also a part of this community of ex-Mormons, right?
Sure.
Mormonism is not just one church, one culture. It it's so intertwined with American identity, and people who have grown up in this religion or maybe adjacent to this religion, and who may feel that their identity has been shaped somewhat, like
Mm.
that's you're going to learn more about those identities from folklore, not necessarily history. Like, my spouse grew up in Utah but wasn't raised Mormon, or LDS, and but he's nevertheless, identified himself in part based on his proximity to the church.
Mm.
So I think those are important things to look at, is how has Mormonism shaped identity in ways that are broader than
Absolutely.
religious affiliation.
Absolutely.
Folklore allows us to get right there on the ground, which is so lovely because it just values every person's voice, women's voices, children's voices. I mean,
Mhm.
it's
As long
it's
as
not
we're
a
clear how we're talking to groups of people.
right,
Yeah.
because we're thinking
How
about
we're
folk groups,
categorized.
and
Yeah.
there's no limit to how many folk
Mhm.
groups. And as you're talking about identity, we all belong to a number of folk groups, as you just said, right? You're Mormon, ex-Mormon, your Community of Christ. And so, the conversations that your numerous folk groups are having with one another, and how you
Ex-Mormons have done such a service to folklore in this moment, because if you go on to Reddit ex-Mormon, like, people want to talk about Latter-day Saint legends, and I mean, when you study them, you have to, every time you're studying a folk group, you have to understand the purpose of a story, why you're telling it, right? And so the purpose of telling it's different, but you're getting these new accounts, these new variants of stories that I have over here at the, in Provo at BYU. I'm getting stories, the versions over here and different here. And the most popular uh, ex-Mormon TikTok has created its own legend. Do you know what legend I'm thinking of?
No, no.
About BYU? This is, soaking, right?
Oh, that's right. Yes. Oh my
Soaking,
gosh.
ex-Mormon
Or
TikTok.
jump humping.
Jump humping. Yes, the new variant of it is jump humping. It was just soaking. And then someone said, wouldn't it be especially funny if there was jump humping?
Google it, friend.
Right. And so I
That's
had
even made it into a TV show.
yes,
It's not it's the jury duty on Amazon
on
Prime.
jury duty.
Get
It was
Shorty.
on Get Shorty. There was a
Yeah.
Mormon hitman on Get Shorty who's
The
dating a
soaking.
girl, and she's like, she wants to break up with him because he wants to keep the law of chastity, even though he's a hitman.
And so
And then
this
he
is his
says, well, there's
rule.
one thing we can do.
Oh
And
my goodness.
soaking all the shows up on this HBO show. But yeah, here is an ex-Mormon legend. I mean, maybe some BYU students do it. I don't know, but it certainly isn't circulating in that community. It's circulating in the ex-Mormon community, which then was able to become part of what we call the folklore-esque, when the commercialized popular culture grabs onto it and says, "Oh, this is great." You know
Yeah.
what Mormons are? They're people that soak. That's what Mormons are, right? So
Yeah. And but then having those communities also gets you, I think it just furthers the existing folklore, and like thorough. I mean, as we've established, there's no good way to be thorough, because there's always new folklore being generated. But if you take, for example, more missionary stories, when you tell a missionary story as an ex-Mormon, it's completely different, and you might tell stories that are not what you would have told as somebody who was a believer, right? And so you get these stories that, whether they happened or not, or if they're just personal experiences, um, they add a new dynamic to an existing and very well chronicled genre of folklore. And that's why, like that, just coming back to that idea that it's just ever growing and ever evolving. I mean, there is going to be no bottom to the folklore barrel for students, for scholars, and it's exciting.
That's very exciting.
I love it.
Great. Well, I want to talk real quick about your podcast. How did you come to decide to do a podcast? And how did that all happen?
I think it was something we played with more than once, and maybe it wasn't even a folklore podcast initially. It was a podcast. It was about Mormon cultures, Mormon studies, and then, I
what did we do? Did we just figure out a program and then say, let's do this?
I really think it was kind of like, yeah, it would be cool. And Chris kind of developed the title, I think
years ago.
And it was like, yeah, that's cool. That's really cool. And so this summer, I think we purchased a microphone, said, hey, let's do a folklore podcast. And then we sat down and we wrote an episode and we did it. And I really think that's all that went into it, was
and
then
we
for a couple years. And
and then the podcast is it's a lot of fun, right? So it's me and Christine talking, and then we get friends and scholars. We'll get you on there at some point who narrate stories for us, right? So we pick out our best stories, and then we have voice actors do them, and then we get to have fun with different programs by adding sound effects and music.
So we use primary sources. So we're using the stories from the archives. We're using stories that people are sharing online. We're talking about digital folklore, right? We're using stories that our friends are telling us or people are sharing after an episode. And so these are the stories that are out there right now. And I guess we should say that this is what Chris and I do and love, and these are the funny things that we talk about all day long in our home and with our kids, and so we're kind of obsessed. It just seemed a natural kind of progression of things.
And doing a podcast is fun. Maybe you've seen this already, but it builds kind of a little community of readers, and so, or listeners, where we get requests for episodes. And it's the greatest thing that's done for us is, we love that thousands of people are listening to stories. Like, we love that, but we also get more stories, right? So we put out stories we have, and then we get emails, and people are like, hey, sleep paralysis. I've had sleep paralysis. And then they write me 3 pages.
Or this wayward missionary one, as you mentioned earlier, the 12 apostates, right? These little apostate groups. And so we did that episode, and then everyone's like, no, but really that happened in my mission for real. Yes. So I gotta tell you this story. And we got so many phone calls and texts and messages. And so I just love it.
So it makes us happy.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's when I feel like folklorists, you get us talking, and it's always exciting. It's the most interesting conversations because you can move from something weird to something really profound in a millisecond, right? Like it's just the most exciting thing to me. I can't help but be interested at all times. The podcast, by the way, is called Angels and Seerstones, a Latter-day Saint folklore podcast. And how many episodes are you up to now?
I think we'll be up to 12 tomorrow.
12,
yeah.
And they're mostly bite-sized. They're not too long. They're about 15-20 minutes.
That's right.
And initially you said, let's make them 7 minutes long so that it's just quick. Someone can get into it. And then, but then we did an episode. I was like, there's too much to say. Yeah. So, these literally could be hour long, but we try to keep it short enough to give people an experience.
So occasionally people write us and say, that should have been double the length, but I think we're going to keep it 15 to 20 minutes.
And we'll come back around to those episodes and we'll talk about them again. So
that's a good run to fizz. Pop in the car, put on the podcast, give 15 minutes of a good folklore story. You get your dirty Coke from Fizz, and then you drive home with another
Got
episode.
Got
Is
it.
there Fizz in Independence?
No, there's not an Independence. I'm actually in Oregon now because I lived in
Has
Independence.
Fizz made it to Oregon?
No, I do
talking
kind
from-
of want to franchise it. If I was a
should.
business-minded person, I would totally franchise it because I can't help. I have the Mormon sweet tooth, which is probably it's folklore in and of itself, right? Is this idea that
is.
Mormons have a genetic disposition for having a sweet tooth, but my spouse drinks coffee and I drink some coffee. I've gotten used to it, but I can't help but really crave just a good sized fizz drink, a dirty
This-
Mountain Dew or something.
This has become part of our culture because even you saying Fizz, Christine and I both thought, what?
And so delicious.
Yeah, we thought, wait a
That's our
second.
go-to.
You mean so
Oh,
delicious.
okay.
But there's
The good one.
there are so many
But-
different soda shops. And I was just thinking, this is the plate. So if someone wants to think about food, Mormon food folklore, right? The folklore of food, right? This is the plate is a wonderful book that Lynn McNeil, Eric Eliason, scholars out here in Utah at Utah State produced.
The
and
latest.
Carol Edison, but yeah, it's fantastic.
What a side comment. But yes, that is good folklore.
Yeah, yeah.
That's-
Oh, yeah. How can we talk about Mormon folklore and not mention funeral potatoes? I mean,
Mm.
whenever I would go to Christmas parties, we'd always have funeral potatoes and so many different varieties. And I had to go by and just try all of them because I'm like, oh, I need to try all of these because they're all different and it's
Yes.
exciting.
That makes
Sorry, I
sense.
didn't mean to take us down there.
Oh, no,
No.
no.
But-
We just started talking about Fizz, and she was just talking about the length of a car ride.
Oh.
Well, it has been a pleasure talking to you. I'm sure we could keep going on, but I don't even know quite how long our podcast episode should be. But I think we're at about an hour or so, and it's pretty late. So we're gonna go ahead and end this here and just prompt our audience listeners to give Angels and Seerstones a good listen. It's a quick bite, a quick little commute, or a trip to your favorite coffee shop or soda shop. If you go to Swig instead of Sodalicious or
Or
Fizz.
Temple. Or
Yeah.
Temple.
But yeah, give them a listen, and I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and we've absolutely enjoyed having the Blythes on. So thank you again, Christine and Chris.
Thank you so much for
Wonderful
having us.
evening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So long, everybody.
We want to thank you for tuning in to the Whitmer Cast. John Whitmer Historical Association is an educational nonprofit institution. For more information, visit www.jwha.info, where you can meet our team and join the association, read past issues of the JWHA Journal, and get updates on upcoming conferences and events. Our theme music is I Love to Tell the Story, composed by Tom Moraine. This podcast is a production of John Whitmer Historical Association, all rights reserved.